Hello, Zane. We're going to take a look at your aesthetics and control, as well as the sun as key. So let's kind of pull your project up here and just kind of take a quick look here through, and you've got to hold and went ahead and did zoom in and the different focal lengths and the different shutter speeds. Looks like you've got them all there. And then you move into the how deep experiment. We'll talk more specifically, obviously, as we get through. I'm just kind of checking over what we have here. You got your equivalent exposures. And then, deep. Okay, so we've got everything sort of posted up there. Cool. So starting off, when with the to hold, it's the shutter speed, and the point here is to, of course, introduce you to the control, the actual manual control of the shutter speed. That would be where you adjust it to the S or the T setting, depending on what brand of a camera that you have. And then dialing it into a specific shutter speed, and what that does visually. That's the key, what that does visually. So a thousandth of a second, that means really nothing to you until you actually see what the consequence of that is. Something happening, 1,000 times in 1 second happens very quickly. So if the lens is opening and shutting in a thousandth of a second, very, very quickly, obviously, when it does open and shut, it has to open up really wide so that it lets a lot of light in during that very short amount of time. That makes sense? So the consequence of having a really fast shutter speed is that on the other side, the camera has to open up super wide when it does it. So as wide as it possibly can, or as wide as it needs to be, that is what the camera decides. When you have it on shutter priority, you decide what the shutter speed is. The camera decides how wide open does it need to be. So the shorter the time, the more wide it needs to be. The longer the time, the less wide it needs to be. In fact, the less wide it has to be. Otherwise, too much light comes in. So what happens then when it hits a wall? Like the camera goes as wide open and it can't go any wider open. Well, not enough light pours through. Doesn't get enough light to expose properly, and the consequence is a dark image. So what do? You obviously have to adjust the light. You have to put more intensity light on there. The only other consequence would be maybe to adjust the ISO to make your camera more sensitive to light, but that only works so far until you start to get some artifacts. So the real control there would have been to adjust the light when you're getting images that are a little too dark for what you're looking for. Now, I don't think these are too dark. I would say they're a little too dark. They're getting on the border of the shadows blocking up. As you can see here, we're getting very little information in areas like this. Not so little information that I would say it's off the charts, but they could stand to be up a little bit more. Now, what happens in the opposite direction is so as well. So when you have the longer times, so an eighth of a second, so something happening only 8 times per second, which still seems fast, but it isn't as fast as 1,000 times a second. It needs to then not be as wide as it was, and so it needs to narrow itself down. So the compensation has to do that, like the hole has to get smaller. Because you went from 1,000th to an eighth. If the light hasn't changed in between the 1,000th and an eighth, then the shutter speed so the aperture must change. The actual hole has to get smaller because now you're getting it more time. You seeing how that works? This is called the reciprocal relationship. That is what you guys study manually later on in the exposures one. So this is what's going on with your shutter, with your exposure. It seems a little too dark up in the 1,000th. It's getting a little bit too bright, almost, not quite, but a little bright here in the highlights. It doesn't seem to be compensating totally well enough. Now, I don't know if you had this on manual and you were attempting to do it yourself, or if your camera was just looking at the wrong areas, that kind of thing. They look a little bit overexposed, meaning a little bit too much light on these, but not enough light on these. So you can start to see what your camera can and can't do, the accuracy at which it can control these kinds of things. You could see at 2 seconds, you can get a lot of movement, but you can see how bright it is now. That means that way too much light is being put into the scene. Now, compositionally, these are very difficult to manage because you can't see what you're aiming at. All you can see is what the image looks like before the activity happens. So you can frame your camera up and focus on things that aren't going to move during the scene, and then have things move. But it becomes very difficult because where do you focus? If you're trying to capture the thing that's moving, it's not in the frame yet. How would you know where to focus? So that's a challenge as well. So you're getting blurriness, not just from the movement of the object, but because sometimes you aren't focused on the object. So the way around that is to aim your focus on the things that are not going to move so that you have at least that object tight and sharp, so that when the audience sees it, they can tell, like, oh yeah, he definitely made it in focus, and these blurry things are on purpose, so that it doesn't feel like a kind of a misfire on your camera or something like that. So compositionally, I think you're kind of, we could have come in just a little bit more, like on some of these, where we're losing the kind of diagonals here and here, meaning like you cropped it so that the end was right here and here, so it became like a horizon here. What that would do is it would create this little bit, if you put your hand over it while you're looking at it on the screen, it creates less tension up there and brings your eye down into the composition a little bit better. You'd see what you want us to see, and that would be this information right in here, rather than the energy created by these corners. There's also a bit too much light reflecting on the background here. You got a pole in there. These little things. Photography is subtractive. I've said this many times. Photography is subtractive. You start off with everything, and then you pay attention and remove the things that you don't want. So the background is very important to be paying attention to. A way around that would have been, obviously, if you had come in a little bit and cropped right here, that would have been the edge of your photo. You probably wouldn't have had this in there, so that wouldn't have been an issue for you. But looking very carefully, maybe coming up higher of an angle, looking down, would have gotten rid of this horizon altogether. You just would have had the information on the table with no other info. So that would have been another way to kind of get around it. It's a difficult thing. I mean, it's one thing to set things at the exposure, but then to do something with it, that becomes something a little bit more of a challenge here. So when you're at 2 seconds and everything is a moving, that becomes a real challenge. I mean, I think you can find ways of making these work if we had a bit more movement going on. Like, for instance, you have a lot of kind of movement happening here. There's a certain energy about that. But some of these just come across as maybe blurry photographs instead of like intentionally. That one's a little bit better too. But I think that really exaggerates. Sometimes you have to push it even farther to make it feel more intentional. Your background's really good back here, though. That turned out well. Okay, so the how deep. What we're trying to do here is really just introduce you to depth of field through aperture. Depth of field is largely created by the size of that hole. Size of the hole dictates, again, how much light is passing through, but also the nature of that light passing through. If it's a tiny little hole, the light has to be relatively organized to get through there. Like scattered light coming from lots of different directions, won't be able to get through there. It has to be from a generally more of a particular angle or a tighter beam of light. So what happens as a consequence is that when you do a critical focus, in other words, you focus your camera on a thing. In this exercise, we focused on the center object. From there, the focus starts to fall off forward and backward. So if I'm the critical focus, focus is going to start to fall off from the back of my head this way and fall off from the front of my nose this way. So when it's a shallow depth of field, it's going to fall off very quickly. And so before it gets to my hand, it'll be out of focus. And before it gets to this hand, it's out of focus. But a long depth of field, that means it's gradually, doing that from the plane, right? It's gradually falling out. So by the time it falls off very slowly, by the time it gets to my hand, it's still in focus because depth of field is really deep. That's the phenomenon I wanted you guys to see in action. I also wanted you to see the difference between one whole f-stop and the other. Like, what is the difference between f4 and 5.6 and 5.6 and 8, so that those numbers become a thing for you. So I had you just set this experiment up, really experimenting. And it looks like you've done everything correctly, except for one thing. Your numbers here, which I'm glad you put them up there, that's totally correct. However, these aren't whole f-stops. 4.3 might have been as wide as you go. And I'm going to need to, you weren't the only one that did this, and I tried to get around to everybody to kind of help everybody understand where that starting point would be. I need to make sure that everybody next time starts on the widest whole f-stop. And I call them whole f-stops only because there's a kind of a calculation that we try to use to calibrate everyone so that everyone is using the same, ruler to look at it. So we're using 4, 5.6, 8, 11, so that you're using those numbers and everybody else is using those numbers. Otherwise, everybody's going to have a different F, right? You have F4.3, somebody else might have F4.7, and it's hard to really relate that. So you've done 4.3 here, which was probably as wide open as it would get. You documented it. That's cool. It's not a whole f-stop though. But then you probably went 1, 2, 3 and got to 6.4, right? That's, again, not a whole f-stop. That's a fraction in between whole f-stops. You did it right. We got the wrong f-stops there. So you still are seeing the consequence, except you're getting the wrong numbers in there. Now, you can see here that they are getting, you are getting more focus, as you can see here, boop, boop, or less focus as you go from a shallow depth, a deep depth of field here to more shallow. But again, you're getting brighter as you go, which should not be happening. A little bit brighter, not a whole stop brighter. So your camera is compensating somehow for you. Something's going on inside that camera that is not staying steady. Whether it's your light meter that is attempting to do something, but you should not be getting it brighter each time you move the f-stop. It should be the same exposure. In other words, the darkness or the brightness shouldn't be changing here. So your camera, what we're learning is your camera is somehow doing some kind of correction here that maybe it shouldn't be doing. We might want to check that out. But otherwise, it looks like you've got it pretty well corrected here. So that's pretty much what that exercise is, straight up. And if you now can visualize what, a certain f-stop is, then you've got the whole point of it. So equivalent exposures, what we're trying to do here is move apertures and shutter speeds and compensate for them in one way or another. So I had you do something at f8 at a certain, like a 60th of a second or something like that. And then have you reproduce it in manual mode, set it yourself, and then bump the exposure one way and then bump the exposure the other way, and so on and so forth. The point of doing that is to get you guys to be further understanding that reciprocal relationship we talked about. This idea of the shutter speed and the aperture being like a teeter-totter, kind of like a scale. Like, okay, so as one gets longer, the other one has to get smaller. As one gets bigger, the other one can get smaller, shorter. All of that is like an up and down. And so as you make the shutter speed shorter, then the aperture can get bigger. As you make the aperture smaller, the time must get longer, all of that. So I wanted you guys to work with that manually so that you're controlling both of them. The reason I want you to work with that is so that you can make decisions in between, the subtle decisions in between that actually give you full control visually over the image. You can make these subtle changes to really customize how the image is going to look. And as subtle as a half a step, or even a 2/3 of a step will really make a change in the aperture or the depth of field or the choices you have with shutter speed and so on. Now, the numbers that you have up here are, let's see, f8, f6.8 at a quarter of a second. So you did the same shutter speed, but different f-stop. Then you went 6.8 at a half a second, and 6.8 for a half a second, 6.8 for a half a second, 6.8 for a half a second. So I'm not exactly sure what we were doing on now. Maybe we need to chat. I mean, first of all, the images are pretty interesting. I mean, this one's probably the least interesting of all of them, but the compositions that you're getting into here, where you're kind of coming in close on them and working with the textures and things like that, these have much more interest. Yeah, these are much more interesting using shallow depth of field. This one gets a little bit, well, you know, there's a little bit of chaos, a little less kind of organization going on here. But this one's quite interesting because you've got a lot of movement, and there's density in one area and openness in the other area in the composition. But as far as the, you know, moving shutter speeds one way and the other, I'm not exactly sure what's going on here either. I'm curious about what's going on inside that camera there. Because it does seem like there's some compensation that's happening that we don't know about here. So have to figure that out. You know better, that's the sandbox. I call it a sandbox because you just get in there and start working, you start playing around. So here, what I was hoping you guys do is just use all of the things that we've been working to up until that point. Visually, aesthetically, to try to find your own kind of lane, your own sort of kind of unique, or your own aesthetic that isn't just you know, a collection of exercises, but maybe a little bit more about what you find interesting or what you find important. So many people went into the movement stuff because that is really, you know, fascinating to work with. I mean, this image is quite beautiful. This is what I'm talking about, taking it to the level where you're not making any apologies for it being a movement image, that it's not in focus, but you still have tone and texture. You still have a very, very well-constructed composition going on here. You have dynamics of angles happening. You have darks to light, so on and so forth. So it's a really, whoops, my mouse is going crazy. It's a really well-constructed image out of something you didn't even see to begin with. So that is what photography can be. Much more interesting than something like this, which didn't quite get it over to the top, right? I mean, there's a huge difference between this and that. This is fantastic. This is pretty interesting as well. I mean, you get a little bit more of that detail, but you're starting to see what the benefit is of, well, if I'm going with a movement, I really need to take it all the way. So what you're able to do is you're able to start getting some sort of other things happen that your eye can't see, that the objects are lending themselves via the light, not their physical shape or their physical characteristics. So that pine cone is no longer a pine cone. That pine cone is shape and light reflecting off of it, and you're using it in order to create a composition of light. See what I mean? How subject ultimately doesn't matter in that case. So that's what I wanted to get you to. And so in something like this, you've got this wonderful sort of darkness going on here. You got the repetition of these sort of scales that are happening, all this movement. It's fantastic. I hope it feel like it's fantastic. Here you go into some complete abstraction, where they become field paintings. Why not? Complete abstract field paintings are wonderful and beautiful. Why can't they be photography as well? So I think those are fantastic. I think you found something that maybe is closer to like things that you're interested in doing. Well, let's take a look at your light sun as not light sun as the key. Let's see, where is that one here? Sun as the key. There we are. Oh, all right. Well, this one was the intermediary. Kind of intermediary. It's the the in between getting you from the studio to outside. We had this collaborative thing where I just kind of wanted to introduce you to the concept of using the sun as your key light, so that you would not be just jumping straight into the follow the sun. I wanted there to be a little bit of a transition between one and the other, and that's what this was really for. And your decision to go ahead and use, just a straight up object as the placeholder, that's fine, because this is just a light study. I think we could kind of play around. I mean, this is kind of interesting, kind of like the gnome sort of placing it everywhere sort of thing is kind of quirky and fun. I mean, I think you could probably do this series over and over again and find even, more subtle solutions to how it's working. But that aside, we'll just kind of take a look at how you're managing the light here, right? We've got things like direct sun, where you're using and taking advantage of the scrim, that overhead hang. This is really not meant to be super complicated. What I was hoping you guys did was just to get comfortable with the sort of working with sun, paying attention to the angles and where it's coming from, understanding the differences between the deep shade, open shade, and bright sun, so that you wouldn't be going from deep shade to bright sun in one photograph, which you're not doing. You have open shade into bright sun because the overhang gives you open shade, basically. So you're in open shade to full sun behind him. Here is just completely open shade. Compositionally, I think we really could have done something better here. This could have been so cool to have something a little bit more of an interaction going on here. These diagonals aren't really participating so much in the photograph, but I think there's a real opportunity here with this guy, this little critter. And your sculpture could have really worked. Getting closer on something like this, coming way in, would have been a really good idea, because you could have incorporated more of the movement going on in here. Lighting wise, I think it does a really nice job, though. You've got well looked shadows. I'm going to guess you're using a mirror on this one, because we've got some really focused light happening. But so the lighting is quite good. I think we want to get a little bit closer in there on there. Here, the deep shade, this is a kind of a nice way. You've noticed you can use that deep shade because it's reflecting a little bit inside that tube. This is actually a pretty good composition. When you get into like using the whole picture frame, you've got this curve going on here that cuts the composition right in half. You've got this tree back in the background, again, creates another curve. You got the curve of dude's hat. This is a really well thought out formal composition that then has the playfulness of the gesture and the tongue or whatever. So this is a really well seen. That's what I'm talking about. Just kind of taking the playfulness of your subject, but then creating this formal arrangement that then solidifies it. So here you're getting that too. Just I think we could have gotten a little bit closer to it as well. Same deal, plunking them right in the middle. You see how over here, he's not quite in the middle, and that kind of creates a little bit more movement. Plunking him right in the middle just kind of zooms him in. It's hard for us to see all the way around the page. If we were zoomed in and kind of had him a little bit off to the side, like on the 1/3 angle, all of the activity back here with the branches would have been activated. It kind of like sets it on, turns it on basically. But with him in the middle, it's kind of like all the gravity goes toward him. It's great when you're talking about a logo because you want all the attention to go toward it. But when we're talking about a dynamic composition where we want the viewer's eye to move all over the place, we kind of want to offset things so that the eye kind of moves around the page rather than dives into one place. Here you got a little bit of a problem with the angle. You needed to be up just a little bit more because you're a little too low on him. But I'm curious about the box behind him. That's kind of a interesting choice. And then the window light. Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty busy background going on here. I think if we would have taken a cue from what I'm going to consider to be the most effective of your images here and seen how effective basically a clean background could have been. I mean, I like the light here is just really well done. Here, the light coming through this window is just great. This is kind of cut off up here. If this was lower, all of the different parts here, the pictures in the background are part of your image. The diagonal angle here, that's part of it. This back here, all of these elements are part of the picture. So if you think about, like if you were drawing this image, like sketching it out, would you have included all of those things right to the edges and stuff? Or would you have excluded them and just kind of had them either not there, or would you have corrected it and had the lines straight? And if you think about that, then you would want to correct those things in a photograph as well. So it's reductive in that we start off with everything and we have to manipulate the camera to get just the right angle, and then sometimes even take things out of the scene when we physically have to remove stuff. It's a real challenge when we have to add something to the scene, like what you're doing with the sculpture there. But you've sort of got him in there, and then you're trying to make a composition around him. That was the activity. I think you succeeded on a few of them, and a couple of them didn't quite go far enough. But the potential's all there, and I think it could have gone, you could continue with a series like this, which would be really, really interesting. So that's what I have for you as far as feedback. I really look forward to more of your photographs. I think you've got a lot going for you here. I do want to kind of find out a little bit more about what was going on with your camera there, because it seemed like definitely your camera's compensating. And there might be just a setting in there that we have turned on that we want to kind of disengage there, so that it's not, when you are deciding to move the aperture and it's choosing the shutter speed, that it doesn't do this extra compensation to brighten the image somehow, because it seems like that's what it was doing. We want to find out if it does or not. So anyway, we will see you in the studio. All right, bye now.